what I'm going to present today is an argument that's under construction. So there are pieces of our work that I'm trying to bring in here, some of the work that you've done that I'm going to try and put together. But the idea of presenting it here is not to say this is my answer, but rather to seek your inputs and suggestions in how we can together or jointly construct an argument that makes sense for the next billion. Ani's absolutely right. The projections say that 2.5 billion are coming by 2050. But let's be modest. Let's just aim for the next billion, all right? Like, if we try to get some framework for handling the next piece of this influx, then we can learn from how to do better for the others, right? So that's a little bit of the thinking. And this issue, so it's called Accommodating the Next Billion Urban Residents, Neighborhood by Neighborhood. It's a deliberate choice, forced in part by my colleague, Kate Owens here. She's been working with me for the last year, and she's a wonderful colleague to have, and you'll see her arguments embedded in this, so it's not a solo argument. I also work with many other people who I won't name just now, but it's all under construction yet. I'm going to focus on two current realities. The first reality is of increasing urban sprawl. So this is an image of Sri Lanka, and what's going on here is that the part in white was the urban footprint in the year 2000, and the part in red is the urban footprint in the year 2010, or the settlements footprint. So it's growing very fast, and in most countries, the land expansion and urban footprint or building footprint is rising faster than population, and therefore we have sprawl. Now, why is that a problem? Talking to urbanists, you all know this, but it's not just about traffic congestion. We also have declining livability. We also have declining productivity with sprawl. And unfortunately, the people who tend to bear the worst brunt of sprawl are low-income people, in part because they tend to get pushed out of cities as they get more and more expensive for housing towards the periphery. So they have to bear the brunt of all of the travel costs and getting to work and living far away and things like that. The next reality is that the urban world is unequal and divided. And this is an image from Colombia. Latin America went first on its urbanization trajectory, but they urbanized at higher incomes. And yet, you see highly divided and highly unequal cities and countries. What you see here is better than what you would see in Africa and South Asia right now. But at the bottom end are the favelas in Medellin, then public housing, and then the rest of the city. And so they're physically different, and they're spatially divided. You have lots of other inequities in these cities, very low and very high incomes right next to each other. High education and zero education right next to each other. Access to world-class health facilities and no access to any health services at all. And the physical access to high-class services on the one end and no services on the other end. And from a housing perspective, the slums and favelas on the one hand, and gated communities and high-rise condominiums, just like New York, in everywhere from Buenos Aires to Azerbaijan to Bombay and Mumbai. 68% are working, and it includes informal jobs, right? And a few percent were in school or in university, but the unemployment rate was an extraordinary, like 28% or so. So a decade or so ago, when Germany hit 14%, there was a national crisis, right? And so this is the kind of crisis you have. You have a crisis on your hands if you have 20+% unemployment. On education, they're doing really well, or they were doing really well. At 79% had completed primary education. As an Indian, I was very impressed by that figure because those literacy rates are not that high in my country, or they weren't at the time. On living conditions, they were doing really poorly, and only 3% had access to a house that had a permanent wall, water, and electricity. So you're looking for a diamond that's fully shaded, and this is just telling you where it falls. It's conveying a lot of other information as well. It's telling you that you could be above the poverty line, have a job, have education, and still have appalling living conditions. So there seems to be no one-to-one correlation, and trickle down isn't happening. But then you could say, well, that's the definition of a slum, because slums are by definition places where you have poor living conditions. But luckily, we had this study, a parallel study in Dakar at the same time. And here is where the data come out on Dakar. Even higher poverty incidence. So 82% are poor, even higher, right? But these are country poverty lines, so they're not directly comparable, but relative to their own country mates, there is a very high poverty incidence. Only 39% are working, much worse than Nairobi. Again, oops. Wow. Okay, that's great. 36% have primary education, again, much worse than Nairobi, and 74% have decent living conditions. So again, there's no one-to-one correlation. You could be poor, have no job, have no education, and still have decent living conditions, right? And if you compare the two, it's clear that the two cities are very different and the slums are very different. And that what's going on in these slums, there is no one kind of slum in urban Africa. So that's a first takeaway. But still, the question arises, did we use the wrong proxy indicator for living conditions? And as we tried to figure this out, we decided to delve into this vertex a little bit more. And so here we got this diamond. It's called the living conditions diamond, and we said that living conditions also have 4 dimensions. One is the unit. What kind of house or apartment do you live in? How many rooms does it have? Does it have permanent walls? How many people per room? Does it have toilets and kitchens? Things like that. What kind of infrastructure do you have? Water, electricity, all of that. What kind of neighborhood do you live in? Is it far from the city center and or jobs? Is it close? Is it near a dump site? Is it on a slope in Venezuela where there is a mudslide and it will wipe your house away? Is your neighborhood safe? And what kind of tenure do you have? Do you rent? Do you own? How long have you lived there? Do you have security of tenure? And each of these have multiple indicators, and I'm going to show that to you by going into the infrastructure vertex. And I'm going to show you results for 6 services. We have data on 10, but it gets a decagon, gets a little bit too much. So here's very quickly, we found that 19% had access to piped water in the house or the yard. The rest used kiosks. 22% had electricity. The rest were using kerosene lamps. In India, they would steal it. At the time in Kenya, they were using kerosene lamps. Toilets, 25% of households had decent access. They were sharing with less than 25 people or some, I forget the exact sharing number. And we call that decent access, only 25%. They were using the bush, they said, which is flying toilets, which is a wrap and throw mechanism, which is not, it's a BBC term, it's called flying toilets. Sewage disposal, 12%, garbage pickup, 12%. At least 1% in the household, one member in the household can afford to use public transit, 20%. Again, we're looking for a fully shaded polygon. It looks really bad. Let's compare it to Dakar, and you can see that you have 84% access to piped water, 82 electricity, all of that. They're not so great on transit, but clearly Nairobi lags Dakar. There's no question that there is a lag between one city and the other, so whatever proxy we were using sort of worked. So then the question is, why is it so bad? And we actually had to go back to the living conditions diamond to interpret it. So the argument here is that unlike the development diamond, these 4 vertices are actually connected to each other. You can use it to understand living conditions, not just in slums and cities in the developing world, but in the US as well. I won't go into that aspect right now. And if you plot conditions in Nairobi, this is what it looks, just one indicator at a time, just for simplicity. 12% had permanent walls, 22% had electricity, just one indicator. Only 37% said they feel safe in their own neighborhood. And this was the most dramatic, and only 8% of people own their own homes. So to me, again, as an Indian, this part was the most surprising, the tenure part, because I had grown up thinking that people build their shacks and then they consolidate them over time. And that's the case in many slum settlements in Delhi, or it used to be when I was a kid or an architecture student in Delhi. So this was very surprising. And then when we compared it to Nairobi, we found that indeed you see a correlation across the vertices that's much better. So in Dakar, you had 96% of the households had permanent walls, 82% had electricity, 48% felt safe, so safety is still a dimension that needs work, but 74% owned their homes relative to 8% in Nairobi. And after lots of research and work, we figured out that that was the driving difference between these two, in the sense that people in Dakar had lived in their house on average for 19 years compared to 5 years in Nairobi slums. And because there was a good mix of owners and tenants, over time they had invested in their housing in Dakar and had been able, had lobbied and had succeeded in lobbying government for services, whereas that had not happened in Nairobi. So that was the conclusion we got to, and the conclusion was that living conditions in Nairobi are terrible. So the point was that this is just a case study of two cities, but I'm arguing that this framework can be used as a decision-making framework. So you can use this framework to make decisions, and if you see this and you have to prioritize on what to invest in one city or the other, and you could just make one investment. I would put my dollar on education in Dakar, if I could just do one thing. And I would put my $1 or whatever, maybe $100 million on living conditions in Nairobi. Now, the world is much more complex, and you shouldn't do one thing at a time necessarily, and I'll write another blog saying the case against one thing at a time, but if you have to prioritize, it's telling you that something is not working in this city context on the living conditions, and that there is some sort of a city effect, right? So that brings us to the next piece. So if you wanted to put your $1 on improving living conditions in a place like Nairobi, what would you do? And let me step back to the question we started with. The next billion are coming. There are already roughly 1 billion people living in slums with terrible living conditions. What can you do to improve living conditions? So there is a spectrum of interventions that you can have to improve living conditions. On the one hand is slum upgrading, one end of the spectrum. The donors like this. The World Bank had stopped sort of doing it. It restarted. Now we have a few big national programs. I'll talk about some, but there's one in Kenya, there's one in Vietnam, and in the past we had done lots of them in places like Indonesia, and Vijay is here, and he was there when the Vietnam one started, for example. But what governments like to do is not so much upgrading. They prefer to do public housing because they feel like this, they still feel like this is substandard stuff, and couldn't we just build our way out of the housing problem like Singapore did? But I'm going to argue there are many, many interventions in the middle. I'm going to name two. I'm going to not discuss all of them. And here they are. So we are doing work in Kenya that's showing how people live in shared housing with shared facilities. I'll just reference it but won't discuss it. There's a service sites option that I will discuss in a little more detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss the first one, slum upgrading, and service sites, because if you look at the developing the living conditions diamond for each of these, the first and the third work on the neighborhood aspect. And I'm going to argue that working and thinking about the neighborhood is a critical way of thinking about how to accommodate the next billion and improving living conditions. So, but before I go to those two, let me just give you a quick image of shared housing in Kenya. This is good shared housing in Kenya because it's permanent walls, permanent roof, and each blue door represents a unit of roughly 3 by 3 meters, 10 square meters roughly. They at times have a joint tap in the compound. This is called compound housing. And they tend to use the outdoors, the compound as their kitchen and things like this. Now here you actually, and sometimes they have a shared toilet facility. And this is a better kind, but there are lots of compounds that are wattle and daub, like Swahili housing. And we're doing research on it, and there'll be a paper coming, and we'll talk about. So the reason this is interesting to us is here is an interesting product of affordable housing that nobody's talking about and focusing on. And I think we can go somewhere with this, but not today. And this is what the Kenyan government is building. NHC is National Housing Corporation, and this is public housing that they're trying to build because they think this is the right way to deliver public housing. But the trouble, this has been tried time and time again, and what's happened is it's really expensive, it's too little, it just doesn't match the demand and things like that. And so, not that it's a bad idea, but we are doing additional work on this as well. But our argument is you need to think about doing this slightly differently so you can do more and reach more people. So it's not that you shouldn't do this, but the World Bank actually has been, you shouldn't do this. So my team and I think you should do this, but it shouldn't look like this. And there's a different way to think about it. But we're not going to discuss that today. And I'm going to switch to the next piece with that. So I'm going to talk about slum upgrading. A lot of you know about this. This is what happens when you go in ex post. Poor people come in, they have access to no land, no housing. There are land invasions, or they squat in some private or public property, they build slums. And then after many years, the goody two-shoes like us from development agencies say, oh, this is awful. We have to improve it, and then we design slum upgrading programs, and they're very well intentioned. The tiniest plot in Bombay or Mumbai now, 21 meters square, and in Chennai, 33. So Sadanathan, the person in Chennai, said, we were like, you're crazy. Only cow sheds in this size. Like only cows would live in 33 meters square or 25, whatever it was at the time, and they kept pushing for increases. And there were variable plot sizes. So if you look at this, the little things in the middle are the tiny plots, then around that 100 meter, then high income. So this is Indian terminology. EWS, economically weaker section. LIG, low income group. MIG, middle income group. HIG, high income group. So they're all there, and they're teeny tiny open spaces, then some large open spaces. Then they had innovations on the land use planning. So the average prevailing allocation for roads and open spaces was like 50 to 60% of the overall land. They went down to 34%. So it was spatially economical. And they wanted mixed use, so they had shops and schools and clinics, and in a site in Chennai, industrial plots too, right? And invariably, these tended to be on the outskirts of the city. So here's what so the idea was it was going to be incremental housing. You would there was supposed to be full cost recovery, and actually they did really well. And then people would build slowly over time. But at the time, I just wrote a blog about this, and I sent it to some of you. So Barjor had gone to one of these sites, and he said he'd seen only toilet cores. And he said, this is a disastrous approach. The sites and services approach doesn't work. There are no houses, no people, and nobody will ever come there because they are so far from the city center. This is just ludicrous. And he published it in the Times of India and Andaman. Maybe you read that, huh? But you were too little at the time. It was 1980. It was too long ago. So anyway, here's what they look like. So on the right hand, these are Kate's pictures. We were there together. On the right hand is an existing unit today, a little bit like the early units, single room shed, right? With tin roofs, and behind it and over here are some of the built up ones. So, on the sides, they have some shops in front and stuff, but people came, they invested. They built floors. They improved their toilets. They built toilets and kitchens on every floor. They have a son or daughter or cousin or niece or aunt living on different floors. They've rented out the top floor. There's a lot happening. These are thriving communities. Incremental housing absolutely worked. It just didn't work in year one when you had just finished construction. It takes time. And it takes time not only in World Bank projects. I was just in Delhi for some other work, and we had a series of meetings with developers in context of the Housing for All program that the Prime Minister has launched. And I asked these developers, what is your timeline for when you start to advertise your project to reasonable occupancy of your project? This is after they've assembled the land, after they have permission, after they start announcing, please come by, put a 10% deposit, and we will build this place for you. They said 10 years. And we, as an international development agency, have a 5-year horizon, 6. And if it's 9, we're like, this doesn't work. I thought public sector is about the long term. We invest in things that the private sector is not interested in, and we take the long-term view instead of the short-term view. It turns out that in urban development, real estate developers have a longer-term frame than we do, which is an embarrassment. So anyway, it worked, but it took time. So what else? They are mixed use exactly as they were planned. So on the right hand is Chennai. There was a whole street planned for mixed use. On the left, there is shops and things like that on ground floors, just like other traditional housing in India and in many, many developing countries. It's all mixed in. So it is mixed use. That means you have shops nearby, you have schools nearby, you have clinics nearby, you can start your own small business yourself, and you have potential for jobs nearby. It's mixed income and it's high density. So on the left, and again, this is Kate's excellent work. She had to personally digitize all these images after going to OpenStreetMap. There's a lot of work. So on the left is a sites and services site in Charkop in Mumbai. The little teeny tiny white ones are the smallest plots. The light yellow ones are the slightly bigger ones. The bigger ones are cooperative housing for multi-stories. And as you can see, there are more roads, it's more organized, it's denser. And on the right-hand side is an adjoining parcel of private development. Look, it's not informal development on the right, it's just formal private development, and it looks worse than the planned development we have on the left. So then you go here. So if this is so if you could get densities like this little parcel here, this is what the density would look like. So all the white bars are from Bertho and Malpesi in 2003. And these are the cities on the x-axis, and the y-axis density in kilometers square, people per kilometer square. So on the extreme left, doesn't even register Atlanta, okay? And you keep going down, and those two orange bars are the density you would get if you did this development in one whole kilometer of these little plots. So you would outstrip any density that exists today. So you can achieve high density with little plots. I think Ani might be having deja vu from 4th year housing studio, which said you don't have to go up. You can get high density by doing plotted development. It doesn't have to be 4-story walk-ups because you can't afford elevators, right? So very high density. So here is a footprint of, on the left, Mumbai and Chennai, of a few sites. And you can see in orange what that planned settlement looks like, the network of grid of streets relative to what's around it. So we want planned neighborhoods like this, and if you had cities that had lots of neighborhoods like this, your entire city would look different. So if you moved away from building 3-4 units of public housing multi-story separately and went for neighborhoods like this, you would have a different kind of city, right? And this last image is, they were supposed to be really far away, and they were. So these little yellow dots that orange dots that you see are sites and services projects. So there were quite a few, but they're still too few, right? There need to be many more. And the white that you're seeing is the building footprint today, right? So the entire city has gone way, way beyond these fringe developments called sites and services project sites of the World Bank, right? So, so what does all of this mean? So just two slides. I don't know how long I've been talking, but just 2 slides. What does all of this mean? For the next billion, we're going to argue that you need to go. So Shlomo Angel has made a major contribution by arguing that you need to plan for future growth, and at the very least, you want to put stakes in the ground. What we are saying is that stakes in the ground isn't enough. Maybe if you really want to set a really low bar, you could do that. But what you want to do is move beyond stakes in the ground. I'm going to argue that. So for the next billion, you're going to have to do redevelopment of current cities the way they are right now, and there's going to be expansion. You'll need both because you're not about to just fit in the next billion or 2.5 billion in the current footprint, right? And we can see the footprint is growing, and there's a reason it's growing. The idea is to check it a little bit. We are arguing that you need to start at a neighborhood level, not at an individual household level necessarily. You want to think about people, or you want to think about them in neighborhoods, right? You want inclusive cities. You do not want divided cities. So what you need for that is you need new affordable housing products urgently. This idea that you just have public housing on the one hand that's expensive and too little, and slum upgrading on the other is too little and too far on the extreme. You need more products, and you want them not just on the periphery, but integrated in the city. So we have some ideas about that. I won't dwell on it. Another thing that we've learned from this Sites and Services by going, it was just pure accident that we got invited, and we were there in October. Small plots give access to different kinds of households, right? And they enhance inclusion. We all know, anybody who's worked on land and housing knows these wild statistics that the rich are this tiny percent of the population, they have this percent of the land. The poor are this much of the population and have this percent of the land. But you can, through small plots, you can start making land available to more people across different parts of this income spectrum, not just for the rich. And then with that, you can just accept incremental development. It requires patience, to quote somebody who commented on my blog. It needs patience. And the private sector has patience. We need to have patience. The next thing I'm going to argue is that the vision should be of not just an inclusive city, but a compact city. We need to carve out or redevelop neighborhoods with the right features. What are the right features? We've seen an example: mixed income, mixed use, dense, walkable, livable. And the thing is, it's not utopian, it exists. And actually, I'm very proud to say that my predecessors, like Vijay, created it. They just never got any credit for it. So I'm here to give credit for this creation. It exists. I'm not inventing, it's not utopian, right? So government has greater land assembly capacity. So in India, in Chennai, even today, they still assemble land and they do development plans. In Delhi, the horrible Delhi Development Authority. In Turkey, TOKI, the housing authority, still put together pieces of land and plot developments. The only trouble is they plot developments only for the middle income and upwards. We are arguing that they can do this and make it more inclusive by using that kind of stuff. And as we know from the US and everywhere else, the private sector follows initial public actions. How do you think the H Street corridor got redeveloped? Why was there gentrification in DC? The public sector made the first move, and then the private sector came. It wasn't the other way around. You need to do the same thing in developing countries. And so this is the last graphic, the last slide. So you want thriving cities, and you can start at neighborhoods to shape both lives and cities. So I'm arguing, or we are all arguing, my team, that you enter through neighborhood and neighborhood planning. You can improve living conditions in existing neighborhoods, right? You can do basic services. Through certain gestures, you can incentivize investment in units. You can do tenure security improvements. You can do neighborhood upgrading of existing neighborhoods. You can plan new neighborhoods and thereby create inclusive cities in the middle. The new neighborhoods are mixed income, small plots, incremental housing. You can also have housing with shared amenities and facilities that I didn't talk about today. And finally, if you have the kind of features we had in those neighborhoods, dense, walkable, transit-oriented, green spaces, mixed use, you end up shaping city form and getting to a city form that's highly desirable. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening. I think it might have gone too long. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, so